Sabrina Salvati, host of Sabs podcast and co-host of the Revolutionary Black Network, was in Boston today covering Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s presidential announcement. Sabby, welcome to the show.
Hi, Kim. Thanks so much for having me on.
You know, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., his campaign owes you a gift basket or something, because honestly, if it wasn't for you covering his campaign today, a lot of us would not have been able to see it because something was up with their feed. I was checking and their feed wasn't going on. And luckily you were there. And so I was able to tap into yours and watch a lot of it through your feed. So they owe you something. A gift basket, bottle of wine, something like that. First of all, something happened at the event, like a fire alarm went off. Can you tell us what that was about?
Yes, there was an alarm that went off in the middle of his speech and he stopped speaking. And then there was a voice that came over the intercom that said there was an emergency in the building. We don't know what the emergency was, but it was a little bit scary, I think, at first, because I did receive messages from people prior to coming to this event saying, be very careful because of the message that he has. They were afraid that someone would try to hurt him in some way, shape, or form. But we never really found out what the emergency was.
So you don't know if somebody just pulled the fire alarm like a prankster, or if there was an actual like kitchen fire somewhere and suddenly, but they got it taken care of, or nothing at all. You don't know anything?
Nothing at all.
Wow. It is it is frightening, though. I mean, knowing the history of the Kennedy family, I'm surprised that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is deciding to run. It's a scary thing. I mean, if he gains any momentum, he's got to be worried about his life. Honestly, if you speak out against power, if you speak out against the establishment, unfortunately, you end up in their crosshairs. And in particular, with his family and the history of his family, you think that would be something he thinks about, but doesn't seem to faze him, I suppose, because there he is giving his big announcement. What was the vibe of the room? Was everybody there just really super pro Robert F. Kennedy Jr., or were there skeptics who were there? You mentioned on your Twitter, you took a picture of journalists behind you and you said, oh, I bet these guys are going to be smearing him or something. So what was the vibe there?
There were some people more on the press side that were asking the question, like, they can't believe that he's doing this, that he's, challenging Joe Biden. Of course, he's not the only one. Marianne Williamson is doing this as well. But I think because this event took place in Boston, I think more people that are a part of the press were probably hesitant to say too much negative things about him, because the Kennedys are beloved here in Massachusetts for the most part. I will say I did notice that in reference to mainstream media or the broadcasting networks, Fox News was the only one that was present. I didn't see CNN or MSNBC. There were other journalists that were sitting at the press table with me. David Weigel, I saw him. He was there. So there were other people from a print outlet, so to speak. But in reference to broadcast media, Fox News was the only one that I saw. And I believe I was the only independent journalist there for this event as well. So it's really interesting. I'll have to go back and check on YouTube to see who covered this event. But I do know when I had a chance to look at the chat while I was streaming, people were saying that nobody else was streaming this event. And I found that to be really interesting, particularly those of us in independent media or left independent media. You would think they would still cover this. And if they're choosing not to, then they're doing the same thing that CNN and MSNBC are, ignoring this campaign, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, it's a little difficult, for people to get out to Boston, I suppose. But if you're a bigger organization like CNN and MSNBC or any of those, you've got people everywhere. You've got satellite offices absolutely everywhere, so they could easily cover. You could get people on flights. That's what the corporation, CNN, can do. They can get people all around the world. They can certainly get them to Boston from Atlanta, right? So, but it's interesting that they're not, but not surprising that they're not covering it, because they're all pro Joe Biden. They don't want anybody to challenge him. What was your? I'm curious about your feelings about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I have to be honest, I don't know what your stance was during the pandemic about vaccines or lockdowns. And can you fill me in on what your stance was on that? I actually don't know what your thoughts were on that.
So Yeah, people have to understand I live in Massachusetts, and my state was one of the states that was locked down, and we were locked down for a long time, or felt like a long time to me. And
Hmm.
in the beginning, I was afraid because of a lot of the pandemic hysteria that I saw, like on media, not just mainstream media, but independent media as well. I was very worried at first. But then as I started to research it more and learn more about it, I was like, was it really necessary for us to lock down the entire state? I also know people that lost their businesses, particularly those who had small businesses. Those businesses are never coming back. And this includes some of the businesses that are in the tourist areas as well. So people lost their jobs, businesses closed permanently. And I had to ask, like, is this really worth it? So I worked in education at the time. And the other problem that we started to face is that we had students who were told to go home and learn remotely, not thinking about the fact that not all of these students have a quiet place at home where they can sit in front of a computer for 8 hours a day, not thinking about the fact that not everyone has broadband internet. So there were some students that lived in rural areas where they didn't have that. So they were in and out of class, and student performance went down. And when you started to raise these concerns, particularly in my state in Massachusetts, you were called like anti-vaxxer, or how dare you bring this up, and you were heavily smeared. So I think a lot of people here just chose to be quiet about it because they didn't want that type of criticism as well. So I did learn more about it. In reference to RFK Jr., I think people need to hear what he has to say in reference to the lockdowns and the pandemic. And it's not just him, there's other people that have spoke out about this as well. I really do believe it did hurt us. It hurt us mentally, it hurt people economically, financially. It put people through a lot of strain. And I think that does need to be said. But I feel like, particularly in certain parts of mainstream media, even if you just talk about it, you're heavily smeared. And so that's what they're doing right now with RFK Jr. Now, I don't
Yeah,
agree with him on every position that he has, but they are heavily smearing him and calling him the anti-vax candidate that's running against
right.
Joe Biden.
Yeah, I ask this because because I didn't think you were you were one that's very, RFK Jr. love him from the beginning. There's definitely the crowd of people who have followed him and agreed with him all throughout, and they very much idolize him. They love him. They think he's wonderful, and I didn't think you were in that group. So that's what's so fascinating about getting your perspective is what is your perspective on him as a candidate, not coming from that crowd. We know the people coming from that crowd, how they feel, right? It's love him. Everything he says is great. But you've come from a bit of a different place thinking, and a lot of people didn't know of him or didn't really follow him or his work or know about his positions on anything until the pandemic. It was when he was a vocal skeptic of a lot of the things going on that a lot of people started to be more aware of him and his work. But you weren't in that crowd of people, I should say. So curious what your take is on him and his positions and his candidacy. What do you not agree with, and what do you agree with?
I agree with him in reference to ending the wars. So he talked about that, ending the wars, anti-imperialism. I agree with him about calling out corruption, the problem that we have with billionaires in this country. I agree with him on all of that. I agree with him calling out the CIA, these government agencies. I totally get him there. I think where he loses me is the fact that he's choosing to run through the Democratic Party. And his campaign
Yes.
manager, Dennis
Yeah, I'm with
Kucinich.
you on
Dennis
this,
Kucinich
right?
went through this. Yeah, he
Yeah.
went through all of this. Dennis Kucinich knows what the Democratic Party is going to do to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So today, one of the things that he said that kind of struck me a little bit weird is that he said he blames Donald Trump for the lockdowns.
Right.
And for someone like me, I live in Massachusetts. I'm like, well, it was our governor who chose to lock
Right.
down the state, not Donald
Right.
Trump. So that was a little bizarre to me. And he would
I
not
have that same
criticize.
criticism. Yeah. Go ahead.
You do too. Yeah. He
Yeah,
would
yeah,
not
because it was
criticize Joe
each government,
Biden.
each government did the lockdowns on their own. In my home state of Idaho, they didn't really do that. I mean, they did for like a week. There
Yep.
was like a minute where they said, well, maybe we should limit, some spaces to like 1/3 of who could normally go in there. But ultimately, they didn't do it like we did here in Los Angeles. And even it was municipality by municipality. It was not only statewide, it was city by city. Whether or not they did lockdowns. Trump actually had nothing to do with lockdown. The border, that's the only thing a president could actually control, is whether or not you're going to accept flights at the international border. If you're going to accept people in on the international border, that's the only thing a president really could control. The rest of it was the lockdowns were actually individual governors, and mostly the
Right.
Democratic governors and Democrat mayors who actually shut everything down, not Trump or anybody who's followed Trump. I don't think there was anybody in that crowd that was all for it. So I agree with that criticism. And I totally agree with the criticism of running in the Democratic Party. It's like, really? But he insists, he says, oh, well, it's my party, like it's a religion. He mentioned at one point, there's problems with Catholicism, but it's my religion. There's problems with this, but it's my, there's problems with X, but it's my X or whatever. But when it comes to the Democratic Party, he says, well, there's problems with the Democratic Party, but it's my party. But it doesn't have to be. A political party is not a bloodline. This is not your relative. This isn't your religion. You can, even with your religion, you could leave your religion. You can leave your party. It's a sports team. You don't have to root for that sports team anymore. You can move and pick up a new sports team, right? You can switch, buy a new jersey, get out of there, right? So I don't understand the desire to hold on to the Democratic Party. Like you mentioned, Dennis Kucinich. The same thing when I asked him, why, Dennis, are you staying with? They don't like you. You should leave. You should totally leave. And I said the same thing to Tulsi Gabbard back when she was running. I said, Tulsi, they don't like you. You should leave. And I think the smartest thing she did was leave the Democratic Party. I think you have to. You have to just exit stage left, get out of there. What are the other criticisms you have?
He did not call out Joe Biden, Kim. You have to call out Joe Biden if you are primary challenging him. I had the same criticism for Marianne Williamson. She didn't do it either. And I'm like, listen, if you're going to call out Donald Trump, make sure you call out Joe Biden as well, because you are running against him. You have to stand up in front of people and you have to tell people what Joe Biden is doing wrong. You can't be hesitant about that. You can't hold back. And I will say, he called out the CIA. He called out those government agencies. You have to call out Joe Biden. But to that same point as well, in reference to the government agencies, he also acknowledged the fact that his daughter-in-law is former CIA and she's a part of his campaign team. So people had criticism over that too. It's like, what are you doing? Like, you can't have one foot on one side and one foot on the other side at the same time. You have to forcefully push back. And I think that's what people want. They want someone who's a fighter. So if I interviewed him, I would ask him, why are you not running as an independent? Do you know you could get support from independents? People have told me, people who are Republicans have emailed me recently and told me that they would support him if he ran as an independent. He could get support from all three political ideologies. I don't understand this. You have to let the Democratic Party go. Kim, I think both you and I know this. We saw Bernie Sanders try to reform the Democratic Party. We saw this with Dennis Kucinich. We saw it with Cynthia McKinney. Like, it's not going to work. And I think he has to know that. So to me, it's just like, if you're going to go all in and say X to both these parties and just run as an independent. But trying to do this through the Democratic Party isn't going to work.
Maybe it's a strategy. I could understand the strategy of running in the party because it gives you way more press. If you're going to primary the sitting president of the United States, you are going to get more press than if you just throw your hat in the ring as an independent, because they're going to be constantly comparing you to the sitting president. Nobody really compares like Ron DeSantis or Trump to Biden, right? They compare them to each other. They know that they're different from Biden. They don't talk about that, so they don't need to. But maybe it's a strategy, and then maybe when he inevitably doesn't get the nomination, because, of course they're going to give it to Joe Biden, and I think that's also an inevitability. They're not going to oust the sitting president for somebody who's completely questioning the orthodoxy of the establishment. They're not going to do that. They're going to give it to Joe Biden. They're going to rig it the way they did in 1968. I think that's when it was, when the Chicago riots at the Democratic Convention happened. They say, we're just going to put somebody in who didn't even, this is the anointed person. We're a private corporate. The Democratic Party is a private corporation. We don't have to do what the voter wants. There's nothing there that we have to do, right? So they know they could just say, no, Joe Biden has it. We're not even thinking about it. Maybe then he'll switch and run as an independent at that point, after he's gotten all of the press. And also his numbers are growing. He started off last week, it was 10%. of
Yep.
the Democratic primary was interested in RFK Jr. Now it's 14% is the latest that's come out. So he's
Yep.
growing just in a matter of days. That's
And I think part of it
significant.
is because right. I think part of it is because he has like that strong like anti-war stance. Like people are tired of these wars. He did talk about the war in Ukraine as well. But he has to remember, if we look back to Ted Kennedy primary challenged Jimmy Carter, and we know like that did not work well. I think there's something to be said for being a Kennedy. Particularly in Massachusetts, there's this idea that you just don't leave the Democratic Party. And I kind of consider him to be somewhat of the black sheep of his family, because some
Yeah,
of his family members have openly spoken out that they are not happy that he is doing this and they are Biden supporters. So my thing is just go all in and just say, listen, I'm walking away from all of this. We need change and we need to do something different. But I think that the message that he gave today, I think it was a strong message, but I will say, I think his speech was a bit too long. I would like to see him shorten that a little bit and focus more on the policies and not as many stories. Maybe he did that because he was in Boston and people know about the family and everything. But going on the road, I think he needs to come out strong with the policies, where he stands on
yeah,
these different issues. And he's saying something that other people are not saying right now. He's saying things that even Marianne Williamson is not saying right now.
right.
So I think people want to hear that. People want to hear someone that is going to make the statement he made today, that poverty that we have in this country at home is related to war abroad. You have to make the connection. You have to think about the money that is spent in this country that's given towards the military industrial complex, the defense budget that we have in this country. There is a connection to war abroad and poverty at home. And that really resonated with a lot of people that were there today. So hopefully he can really drive that message. But I would like to see him run as an independent.
I am with you on that. I would like to see that as well. Maybe there's a strategy with it. I don't know. I did. I liked the story. You know, he did definitely tell a lot of stories. One story that I really liked was when he was explaining why he chose to make the announcement in Boston. Now, he lives in Los Angeles, where I am, but he did the announcement in Boston. And he says, you know, obviously the Kennedys have strong ties to Boston. He grew up there in Massachusetts. But on top of that, I loved that he brought up the revolution, the American Revolution, and the Boston Tea Party, and the fact that that was rooted in the colonies being so pissed off at the corruption of the empire and of the corporate sort of crony corruption that was going in on that, the high taxation, and how he brought that in as really his whole campaign as well, that he's going to be going after the merger of the corrupt merger between corporations and government, and how they've just bought off every aspect of our government. And that's why we can't have nice things for the people, truly for the people. So I thought that was a nice story, kind of bringing up the American Revolution. I don't know, you as a Bostonian, if you appreciated that.
I did appreciate that one. I really did. And I will say, too, his connection between like his career as an environmentalist and
Yeah,
also the connection to these wars. And this is something I will push back on climate activists about. Those who say they care about the environment and climate change, but at the same time, they're for these wars. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, we're talking about the military industrial complex, which is what the largest single most polluter in the world. That doesn't make a connection there. So I think that's a very strong message that he has as well. And I really do think that people are starting to ask, like, do you think he's polling the way that he is because of his name? And I said, it could be some of that, but it could also be because I tried to tell people this. The mandates, a lot of people have problems with that. People have problems with the vaccine issues. People have problems with some of these states being locked down. That's a big hot button for a lot of people that lived in those states where they were locked down. So that's a big issue. And also the anti-war issue, and also this issue with Russia and Ukraine. A lot of
yeah,
people are tired of these wars, and they're tired of people just going over there losing their lives, and the people who live there losing their lives that aren't even fighting in these wars. They're tired of people being penalized who have nothing to do with these wars, but they're penalized because they come from the countries. Same thing here. You had the Boston Marathon, which was Monday. They decided to penalize runners who were from Russia and Belarus and
yeah.
remove them from the marathon. It's things like that that are happening. So I think that you need that kind of voice that he has to push back on the system, especially now because Joe Biden is not looking good at all. So I think
Right.
his voice is very powerful, but I just want him to walk away from the party.
Yep. Sabby, thank you so much for joining us. Sabrina Salvati, host of Sabby Sabs podcast, which you could check out on our YouTube channel, which is where you can also watch the entire thing as well if you would like to watch RFK Jr.'s speech. It was about 2 hours long. So, Sabby, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Kim.